that fact. But I can promise you, when you read the Bible, you will find no science in the Bible. That's why when Matt says, as science increases and grows, God shrinks, he's wrong. Why? Because science doesn't prove God exists. Science doesn't disprove God exists. God is not a scientific question. God is a philosophical, theological question. Yes, unfortunately, religious people, some Christians included, have tried to use...
So gentlemen, with no further ado, each of you will have 8 minutes for your opening remarks.
A lot of people say to me, Cliff, I wish I had your faith. And what they really are saying is, Cliff, I wish you could be so intellectually naive. I wish I could be so intellectually naive to believe all this garbage that you've apparently been able to swallow. But I've got a bit too much on the ball intellectually, and I can't believe in God, I can't believe in Christ. I believe in God, I believe in Christ, because of the evidence. What is the evidence that God exists? First piece of evidence. The Big Bang tells me that the universe is not eternal. There's a beginning. Everything that has a beginning has a cause. The universe has a beginning, therefore the universe has a cause. Not everything has a cause. Everything that has a beginning has a cause. The universe has a beginning, therefore the universe has a cause. If you hear bang, and I ask you, what caused that? And you say nothing, that's irrational. Everything that has a beginning has a cause. The universe has a beginning, therefore the universe has a cause. Second reason that I believe in God, that God, some type of God exists, is because the evidence of order and design points to a designer. This shirt does not point to a hurricane passing through a cotton field. This shirt points to a tailor who sewed the thing together. A BMW does not point to a hurricane passing through a metal junkyard. It points to a rational mechanic bringing amazing order in a BMW. You do not get the unabridged dictionary from thousands of monkeys banging on typewriters over thousands of years. Instead, you get the unabridged dictionary from an intelligent mind communicating and bringing order. Third piece of evidence for God's existence is DNA. There is more information packed in the DNA of a single cell than there is information packed in 30 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica. I am not saying that the Encyclopedia Britannica is paper, glue, and ink. It's the information in the Encyclopedia Britannica that points to an intelligent mind. In the same way, it's not the material of DNA that points to an intelligent creator. Instead, it's the information, the amount of densely packed information in the DNA of a single cell that points to the existence of some type of God. If you and I are walking up and down the beach, and we come across ripples in the sand, and you ask me, hey Cliff, how did these ripples get here? I'll say, obviously the ocean. The waves coming up on the sand, coming back, made the ripples. And that's rational. But if as we're walking down the beach, we see in the sand, John loves Mary. And if you ask me, hey man, how'd that get in there? And I say to you, oh, the waves did it. That's stupid. Why? Because densely packed information demands an intelligent mind. There is more information, densely packed information, in the DNA of a single cell than there is in 3 sets of the 30-volume Encyclopedia Britannica. That demands an intelligent mind. Fourth piece of evidence for the existence of God is the innate human drive for meaning. All of my atheist friends are wonderful people. All of my atheist friends have created meaning for their life. But almost none of my atheist friends are willing to live as if that meaning is totally subjective, relative. Instead, they attach real meaning to their life. Why? Because obviously you and I as human beings thirst for meaning and purpose in life. Shakespeare wrote, life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. You can't live that out. Because when you grapple with the meaninglessness of life that is intellectually consistent with atheism, you have to grapple with the fact, my life means nothing ultimately. What that means is, I could become like Adolf Hitler, or I could become like Mother Teresa. It ultimately doesn't matter. But you see, you can't live that out. Instead, we, as human beings, insist upon attaching meaning to our lives. Jesus Christ pointed out, you were created by God for a purpose. And that purpose is to love God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. That makes rational sense. It makes so much sense that almost every single one of my atheist friends says, yeah, I think love is probably the most important thing in my life. Very good, my atheist friend. You're onto something. Guess what? That love is not just a biological urge. That love is not just a sex drive. That urge is not just a drive to preserve the genetic pool. That urge, that desire, has been placed in you by God. And you know it makes sense because you're so committed to living your life as if there is meaning and purpose to life. Next piece of evidence that God exists is the resurrection, historical resurrection of Jesus Christ. I did not make up God. I didn't make up Jesus Christ. Jesus was an historical person who really lived, taught, died, and rose from the dead. The Catholic Church didn't make up Jesus. Dan Brown did not make up Jesus as a Da Vinci Code. No, Jesus was a real person. And we have eyewitness testimony. Matthew, Mark, John, Peter, James were eyewitnesses of this historical Jesus. And they wrote what they saw, and they wrote in the first century. Why? Because Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch in 95 AD, quotes Matthew, Mark, and Luke in his letters. The fact that he quotes them in his letters in 95 AD shows unequivocally that Jesus obviously lived, that eyewitnesses who saw Jesus obviously wrote about him. Too many people have thought, oh no, the Gospels were written hundreds of years later. One manuscript find, the John Rylands manuscript in the John Rylands Museum, Manchester, England, is a fragment of the Gospel of John, chapter 18. And it is dated between 117 and 130 AD, which clearly points us to the fact that the Gospels were written in the first century. This Jesus Christ we read about as an historical person lived the type of life that in my best moments I try to live. Guess what? I fail. I try to live like Jesus. I blow it consistently. If you don't believe me, talk to my wife, my sons. They will verify that. Jesus Christ didn't blow it. He lived it out. And in John chapter 8, he could look into the faces of his enemies and say, which one of you guys can prove me guilty of sin? And his enemies were silent. The Apostle John, Jesus' closest friend, lived with him for 3 years. In 1 John, he writes, in Jesus is no sin. Gosh, that demands my respect. And then when I read the Sermon on the Mount, I see, wow, the ethical teachings of Christ are profound. He's an ethical genius. Then I watch him die on a cross as I read the Gospels. And I see that at the moment of his most excruciating pain, instead of cursing his enemies, he prays, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And my respect for him grows. But fourthly, and most importantly, not just his lifestyle, not just his teachings, not just the way he died loving and forgiving his enemies, but fourthly, the way he rises from the dead makes it a no-brainer, guys. He is reliable. Now, the reason that the Christian God is so rational, the reason that belief in Christian God is so rational, is because, as Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15, if Jesus is not risen from the dead, we're fools for believing in him. I love that. That means that faith in Christ is, you can falsify it or you can verify it. Think carefully, examine Christ.
Am I on? Yeah. I apologize, I'm not going to walk around. I've been sick for a couple days. Thanks so much for having me here. Is belief in the Christian God rational? This isn't just a question we're here to debate this evening, it's the question that ultimately led to my own atheism. Just over a decade ago, when I was a Bible-believing Christian, I was convinced that the answer was an unequivocal yes. And my goal was to affirm that and share it with the world. Hopefully I can explain in a way that everyone can understand why my mind has changed. First, the fact that we're still debating these claims after thousands of years of debates between both laymen and scholars should demonstrate that the only reasonable answer to this question is no. Can you think of any other category of claim that over thousands of years has not only failed to make any marked improvement in its supporting evidence, but has actually become less credible as we learn more about the universe we inhabit? It is by definition irrational to believe such a claim. The claims of Christianity were constructed, as the claims of other religions were, to fill the gaps in our knowledge. When we find evidence-based answers, the answer has never been God did it. And while this should eliminate God as we fill those gaps, Instead, the specific claims of Christianity and other religions morph chameleon-like to conform with the facts, or the facts are just flatly denied. I don't know precisely what arguments Cliff plans to offer tonight. Obviously, I wrote that ahead of time. It's likely that we'll hear some version of the cosmological argument, the argument for design, perhaps a little about the anthropic principle, maybe the moral argument. These and other classic arguments for the existence of God have been trotted out time and again. They fall in and out of favor, and they're occasionally repackaged in order to obfuscate the fallacies and avoid the classic responses. But let's be honest, this is a prime example of starting with a conclusion and attempting to construct and reconstruct an argument that supports it. The rational mind does not lead the evidence where it would like to end up. It follows the evidence wherever the evidence leads. I'll try to address these arguments if they're presented and there's time in the format, but it's important to note that even if all of them were valid and sound, and they're not, they would be irrelevant to tonight's question. Those arguments do not and cannot confirm the reasonableness of Christianity. Those same arguments are trotted out by Muslims, pantheists, deists, and apologists of other religions, because they at most lead to a generalized God concept that does not confirm anything unique to Christianity. I don't know how familiar any of you are with the Drake equation, but briefly, it's an attempt to estimate how likely or how many other intelligent species are likely to exist in the universe. And no matter how accurate the Drake equation is, it would be irrational to attempt to use that generalized claim to support the specific claim that there are reptilian aliens masquerading as humans and controlling the world. And yet, time and again, I run into Christian apologists who attempt to use these generalized arguments to prop up the specific claims of Christianity. If we're going to address Christianity's rationality, we need to look at the specific claims and the evidence supporting them. Unfortunately, this means that we're talking about analyzing the Bible and historical text to determine if its claims are rational. And as with any ancient source, this is a bit problematic. Some would argue that the Bible's accuracy on mundane claims and the sincerity of its authors is enough to justify believing its miraculous claims as well. That seems to be the height of irrationality. Cliff and I could each list 10 things that we honestly, sincerely believe, but the truth of each of those 10 claims is that each of those 10 claims are all independent, and our sincerity and our honesty are irrelevant to the truth of those claims. Truth is not impacted in any way by the number of people who believe something, the strength of their convictions, or how long an idea has been popular. What does it mean to say that a claim is rational? Does it mean that we've proved that it's actually true? No. Does it mean that we're absolutely certain? No. Absolute certainty is an irrelevant distraction. When we identify that a claim is rational, all we're saying is that it's met its burden of proof that the evidence for the claim is sufficiently strong that an objective application of reason would conclude that the claim is more probably true than not. You can believe things to varying degrees of certainty, and the rational mind attempts to ensure that the confidence level is proportional to the supporting evidence. Additionally, one's actions tend to be apportioned to one's confidence level. I have more confidence in our new car than our old car, so when push comes to shove, I'm driving the new car. What you say about your beliefs can differ from what your beliefs actually are, and even what you're aware of. And I might say, oh no, I have all the confidence in the world in our old car, but the truth comes from what I actually end up doing. All claims are not equal. If you tell me that you saw a cow on the way into this debate, that's a very different claim from telling me that you saw Jesus floating around campus causing amputated limbs to regrow. One of those claims is ordinary and the other one is extraordinary. And extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Anecdotal testimonies are not sufficient. When we're trying to determine how reliable historical documents and claims are, we're in a bit of a sticky situation. Which experts do we trust and why? After all, we can't all be experts, and the study of history often depends on individual historians doing their best to determine how accurate a claim is, only to find other historians disagreeing, and absent a time machine, and there's no clear path to truth. There are, though, new possibilities. Historian Richard Carrier, for example, is advocating the use of Bayes' theorem as a means of determining the historical probability of reported events. He outlined the case for Bayes' theorem in his book, Proving History, and his next book is going to make use of this method to evaluate the historicity of Jesus. He's going to use Bayes' theorem to evaluate the information from the seriously limited sources that mention Jesus. That said, the existence of an individual is mundane. The existence of the supernatural is not, and no historical account should be considered sufficient on its own to rationally justify extraordinary supernatural miraculous claims. I'm not asserting that the supernatural and the miraculous are necessarily impossible, but until we have reliable confirmation of this type of claim, hearsay evidence cannot be sufficient. We need to first demonstrate that the supernatural is possible before we can determine how probable it is. And then, depending on how probable it is, we can begin to determine what sort of evidence should be sufficient to justify rational belief. It would be irrational to believe the supernatural claims of the Bible based solely on the hearsay claims that would not be sufficient in a court of law, and many of the sources would be excluded as hearsay. The burden of proof rests firmly on those who assert that Christianity is reasonable. And if all we're presented with are generalized arguments, hearsay accounts from ancient books, and anecdotal testimony from ancient sources, we simply cannot find that belief in the Christian God is rational. When we hear a claim, there's a heuristic model that we run through in our head. It's something that we train ourselves to do for our entire lives. Every decision we make and every belief that we hold plays into this. And we ask ourselves questions like, is this claim consistent with reality as I understand it? What's the evidence for this claim? What do I know about the person making this claim? Are they honest? Do they have something to gain? If I accept this claim and I'm wrong, what is the impact to me? If I accept this claim, what current beliefs that I have will I have to change based on this new belief? And is the evidence for those existing beliefs stronger? In which case, it would be irrational to abandon stronger beliefs that are supported by stronger evidence in favor of new beliefs that are supported by weaker evidence. As David Hume taught us, reject the greater miracle. Here's the crux. The Christian God should have an understanding of the burden of proof and the nature of evidence. That he continually fails to supply the sort of evidence that would rationally justify the belief demonstrates that either this God doesn't exist or isn't willing or capable of providing a rational justification for its existence. In either case, belief in the Christian God simply is not rational.
All right, Matt talked about the fact that we're here debating the issue shows that God doesn't exist. Excuse me? We debate all types of issues. We debate issues in science, in politics, in history, in psychology, and I can assure you, the fact that we debate an issue says nothing about whether truth exists or not. The fact that we debate an issue is healthy. We're seeking to struggle through what does the evidence point to. And the fact that we debate something doesn't mean that God doesn't exist or that historical facts don't exist. Rather, we're pushing ourselves to think more deeply. What does the evidence point to? Matt says, as knowledge of the universe increases, the God of the gaps shrinks. Good. I'm happy of that, for that fact. But I can promise you, when you read the Bible, you will find no science in the Bible. That's why when Matt says, as science increases and grows, God shrinks, he's wrong. Why? Because science doesn't prove God exists. Science doesn't disprove God exists. God is not a scientific question. God is a philosophical, theological question. Yes, unfortunately, religious people, some Christians included, have tried to use science to prove God's existence. That is intellectually dishonest. Why? Science is based on what you can observe. Can you see God? No. Can I see God? No. Therefore, it's dishonest intellectually to say, I can prove that God exists scientifically, and it's equally dishonest for an atheist to say, I can disprove God exists scientifically. Why? Because you can't observe God, it's impossible to scientifically verify whether God exists, or to scientifically verify that he doesn't exist. Why? Because God is not a scientific question. Now that shouldn't blow any of us out of the water. Why? What are Matt and I doing right now? We're not having a scientific discussion. We're having a philosophical discussion. And if you narrow truth and the search of truth to simply scientific truth, then this debate wouldn't be happening. Matt's not using science. I'm not using science. We're using logic and reason. Guess what? Logic and reason is not science. It's a rational, thoughtful discussion we're having, but it is not a scientific experiment. Matt also says that the Bible, probably isn't accurate. Well, wait a second. I would encourage you to ask yourself, how do you determine the historical accuracy of any document? And I hope you'd come up with some tests. For myself, I've got 4 tests that I use on any document that claims to be historical. Internal consistency, literary style, Archaeological evidence and manuscript evidence. If you don't like my test, no problem. Just come up with your own test that you use to determine whether any book, be it the Bible, be it American history, African history, Asian history, any book is reliable or not historically. Apply those tests to the New Testament Gospels, and I'm convinced if you've got fair tests, they'll pass them with flying colors. Now, listen carefully to Matt. The only reason that you cannot accept the Bible as historically reliable is because it contains miracles. And therefore, because it contains miracles, we all know it's false. Baloney. That is a philosophical presupposition of naturalism that Matt is espousing. Philosophically, obviously, if naturalism, the philosophy of naturalism is true, then obviously miracles don't happen. Because you have to have a supernatural God to change a law of nature to cause what you and I call a miracle. Fair enough? So, it's intellectually dishonest to say, well, I can't accept the New Testament because Jesus walks on water. And we all know that it's impossible to walk on water. Yeah, we do know that a high percentage of the time, you walk on water, you'll sink. But if there's a supernatural God who created the laws of nature, who created water in the first place, then it's not irrational to say, wow, this supernatural God performed a miracle. He became a human being and he walked on water. That is not irrational. Obviously it's irrational to think that Jesus walked on water if there's no supernatural God. Then obviously miracles are stupid, really dumb. But that's a philosophical issue. Now, when you read the Gospels, understand its history. Understand that you better be open to the philosophical position that there's some type of supernatural God, maybe. And then if you allow for that, a miracle is not stupid, it's not irrational, it's the supernatural God who created the natural laws in the first place, changing a natural law, performing what we call a miracle. Now, that said, truth is not determined by the number of people who believe. Very good, we agree. Jesus Christ is not the truth, because a lot of people believe in him. And I can promise you, if you ever asked me, Cliff, why do you believe in Jesus? And I said, well, because a lot of people believe in him. That'd be idiotic. Really stupid. Truth is not determined by majority opinion. You know, at one point in human history, the majority of people thought the earth was flat. Did that make the earth flat? No. Guess what, folks? Just because a bunch of people believe something does not make it true. And that's why those of you here tonight who think that truth is determined by culture could not be more mistaken. I can promise you, just because a lot of people in a culture believe in sute, the burning of a widow after her husband dies, doesn't make it right, doesn't make it good, doesn't make it the thing to do. Truth is not determined by majority opinion. Truth is that which is real. And the challenge for you and me as thinking human beings is to get in touch with what is real.
Sure, so apologies for coming off arrogant and condescending, but what I heard was a strongman version of almost everything that I actually said. Right from the very beginning, he claims that I said the debate shows God doesn't exist. I've never said that. Did I say that? No, what I said was the fact that we've had this debate and had it for so long with no progress could be enough to say that this is not a rational belief. Not that God doesn't exist. If you can't just straw man what I'm saying when I'm talking about a rational argument, pretend like I said that, oh, we've had a debate, so God doesn't exist. I love debates. I wouldn't be doing a debate. My point wasn't about a debate. It was about the length of time that we have had this same debate, making absolutely no headway, and in fact, losing headway. The claim that God is shrinking and the explanation to the universe, well, I'm going to skip that for a second. When we talk about God, it's funny, Cliff says we can't see God. And yet, I have this feeling that Cliff, like most other Christians, believe in a God that actually manifests in reality, because if he doesn't, then there's no point in having this discussion anyway. How did anybody ever come to the understanding or knowledge of the existence of this God if it doesn't manifest in some way in reality? Cliff says we're not talking about science here, we're talking about philosophy. Logic and reason is not science, excuse me, but logic and reason applied to the evidence is in fact science. That's what science is. when you're talking about a God that manifests in reality in some way, we attempt to use science to confirm the historical claims. It is not pouring solutions into beakers, but it is most definitely science. Archaeology, you go tell an archaeologist that they're not a scientist while they're confirming the events of history, and I think you'll be in for an interesting discussion. Several times there was this portrayal that that I said that something was false, when actually what I talked about was it not being true or not being able to demonstrate that it's true. There's a difference between these two things. If you think about it, the example I've used many times is a courtroom analogy, and when somebody's on trial for murder, the fact of the matter is that they are either guilty or innocent, but we don't ask people to evaluate that question. We ask them to evaluate the question of guilt because we understand how to establish the burden of proof. And saying that voting that you think that somebody is not guilty is not the same as claiming they are innocent. And saying that the God of Christianity is not reasonably justified is not the same as saying that God doesn't exist. And saying, as an atheist, I do not believe that God exists, is not the same as me asserting no God exists. There's a difference between I do not believe God exists and I believe God does not exist. Those are different claims. And we seem to get a little muddy here in the confusion there. We talk about, well, why do I believe? He presented his reasons for believing, the classical arguments, which if I have time before I get through, I'll add some quick notes on. But he said he didn't just believe because a bunch of people believed. But the only argument that he presented on behalf of Christianity was the resurrection. Why do you believe the resurrection? Because a bunch of people believed it and reported it. You have no evidence of the resurrection. We have no way to verify this happened. We don't have a time machine. And we are implying, or the Christians are implying, that because these people sincerely believed something and reported it and even died for it, that therefore it must be true. That is simply not logical. It is not rational. Reality doesn't work that way. We can say, I have confidence in it, and I kind of think maybe so. I'll tell you this, I love my mother, and I'm friendly with Richard Dawkins. I don't know how many people are familiar with him, brilliant scientist, hardcore atheist. If they both came to me and said, hey, I had this vision of Christopher Hitchens last night, I'm not going to believe either one of them, even though I know them to be trustworthy, even though I know that I would believe that they experienced something and were attempting to relate it, but I cannot establish a causal relationship between what they're proposing, that some God did something, and the actual event. There's no way to link a causal relationship between God and resurrection, other than an argument from ignorance of, well, we have this claim of a resurrection, I'm going to assume that it's true because these people are trustworthy. How could this happen? I don't know. Must be God. That's not the way reason works either. On the classical arguments, the design argument, we recognize design not by complexity. Actually, simplicity is a hallmark of design. We recognize design by contrasting it with that which is naturally occurring. It's patently absurd to run around to living things that have a mechanism for reproducing themselves and implying that they're designed in the same way that a building or a bridge or whatever is designed, when all of the evidence for buildings and bridges point to them being designed, and no evidence points to them occurring naturally. And in the case of human beings and planets and solar systems, all of the evidence points to them occurring naturally by natural laws, natural rules. No evidence points to them actually being designed. I think there was one more classical argument that I wanted to make sure I was... Oh, this idea about meaning and purpose in life. Well, I have 30 seconds. The fact that you think you have a desire for meaning and purpose in your life in some transcendent sense doesn't mean it's actually there. The fact that you have a hunger doesn't mean there's actually food. This is simply a fallacious argument start to finish. When we talk about meaning and purpose in our life, how many of you would like somebody else to pick your major for you? Because that is the type of meaning and purpose that Christianity is claiming you need to have. You have a God-imposed purpose. You have a God-imposed. Wouldn't it be preferable to make your own choice? But your preference doesn't matter to the truth.
Now we'll move to the section of the debate where each of the speakers will have the opportunity to ask questions of the other. So for the next 6 minutes, we have 4 questions.
All right. Matt, thank you so much for being here tonight. You've made point consistently that you're a rational human being, and the reason that you cannot believe in God or the Christian God is because of lack of evidence. So my question is simple. What are you living for? And what is the preponderance of evidence, this overwhelming evidence, that what you are living for is true? Because obviously you said the reason you cannot believe in a Christian God is because of lack of evidence, which clearly implies in order for me to live for something or someone, there's got to be X amount of evidence. So the question is simple. What are you living for? And what's this preponderance of evidence that shows that convinces you that whatever it is you're living for is true?
Whatever it is that I'm living for, what shows that it's true, I don't know that it's a truth claim. I don't know that there's anything that could show that it's true or that it actually is true. I think we're talking about a classification error. If I determine what I want my life to be, there is no truth to that other than this is what I've determined my life to be. That's exactly the point that I was making, that I don't have, nor do I see any need for, nor do I see any actuality of an externally imposed truth, or meaning, sorry.
Okay, but you obviously have decided that something's worth living for. You wouldn't dress the way you
Sure.
do, you wouldn't live your life the way you do.
Sure.
Now, the reason that you cannot accept God or Jesus Christ is because of lack of evidence. Fine, I understand. But when you say that, you're implying that before I believe something, X amount of evidence has to be produced. So my question remains, what are you living for, and how has X amount of evidence been produced for you to show you that this is true and worthy of you living for it?
As I said before, not all claims are equal, not all claims require the same amount of evidence. There are some things that are evident unto themselves. I am defining that this is my meaning and purpose to life. I am not declaring that it is true in the sense that you're talking about. As I said, I don't even think that it can be true. It simply is what I choose to do. Now, why? It's because I have seen evidence that living one's life in a certain way is better than living one's life in other ways. That there are actual benefits that make life more enjoyable, more worth living.
And what is that?
What is what?
What is it that you're living for, and why are you living for it?
Okay.
The question remains on the table. I need an answer.
I am living, first of all, because I can't help it. But second of all, I continue to live because I have a desire to learn new things and to believe as many true things and as few false things as possible. Because I am convinced by evidence that if you live your life believing as many true things as possible and as few false things as possible, you will lead a better life. We have seen the evidence for this in that people who believe false things are prone to very dramatic errors, like running into traffic. Life is generally preferable to death. If you can't agree on that, then we can't even have a discussion about meaning and purpose or morality.
July 1881, Charles Darwin wrote a letter to a man named Mr. Graham. And in this letter, Charles Darwin writes, in light of the fact that our brains are simply highly developed monkeys' brains, why do we trust our brains to tell us the truth? You seem to be communicating that my rational mind tells me what's worthy of me living for. If you believe that your mind is simply a highly developed monkey's mind, why would you trust the thoughts of a monkey? Why would you trust your own thoughts if that's what you believe? That the rational mind is simply an accidental collection of atoms from a highly developed monkey's brain?
Well, I don't. The accidental characterization I don't actually agree with. Evolution is not an accidental process. It's guided by natural selection, and that's the reason why things fit their environment and we perceive design. But the question of why would I trust this slightly advanced monkey's brain? And it's because I don't, first of all, I mean, we can't ever get around the problem of hard solipsism. I concede that right from the get-go, but we don't need to. Because I have the ability, for example, how do I know that this is a bottle of Coke Zero? I can use my senses and I would have to possibly trust them. I disagree with philosophers on whether or not it's properly basic because we know our senses can be fooled, and so we seek independent verification from others. And so I learn things by watching others just as monkeys do. And I live my life in the way that seems to be, not as a declaration of absolute truth, but seems to be the best way to enjoy life and be healthy and proceed, just as monkeys do.
Okay, and that's my basic problem, your answer. Why? Because you started out by saying The reason I cannot believe that God exists, and the reason I can't believe in Jesus, is because of lack of rational evidence. But now, when I ask you the question, what are you living for, and what is this preponderance of evidence that supports what you're living for, I get no evidence. I just get, this is what seems to me to be best, this is what I feel like, this is what I choose, fine. But don't you see the intellectual hypocrisy, Matt, of your position? You're saying the reason that I can't believe that God exists, that I can't trust in Christ, is because of lack of evidence. Fine, I got no problem with that. But what that implies is, in order for me to trust someone, not to believe it's true, but just to trust someone or something enough to live for it, I've got to have X amount of evidence. Now I'm waiting, Matt, to hear X amount of evidence for whatever it is you're living for, that it's reliable, it's not going to let you down.
Well, I never said it wasn't going to let you down, and you're looking for evidence at a level that is just patently absurd. If you're trying to claim that the resurrection of an individual is a claim that demands evidence that is on par with how do you want to live your life, we're at an impasse, because I think those are absolutely different category of claims.
We're not at an impasse.
So, first question, should anyone accept Christianity as Christianity? Oh, it's a slip, he just lost. Should anyone accept Christianity as rational and true based on your personal testimonial claims?
No. Nobody should believe in Jesus because I have a testimony.
Okay.
The only reason people should believe in Jesus is because they see the evidence points to his reliability.
Okay, if we can't believe it based on your testimony, why would we believe it based on the testimony of the gospel authors?
Because I never saw Jesus, but Matthew, Mark, John, Peter, and James saw Jesus. They are in a much better place to tell you about Jesus than I am. I never saw Jesus, they saw him.
Well, you've never met my dad, but my mom has, and if my mom were to claim that my dad died and came back, clearly we wouldn't believe her based on just her word.
Speak for yourself.
Well, okay. You don't know my mom either, but I mean, would you believe her if you knew her to be trustworthy? Would you believe your wife if she told you that her father died and came back?
Man, I can promise you, my brother transplants kidneys and livers at the Emory University Hospital in Atlanta. And I can promise you, sir, there are people who have been pronounced medically dead.
Yes.
And there have been
resuscitations. It's not the same thing as being dead and buried for multiple days and rising bodily and ascending to heaven.
Good point.
We're not going to make, equivocation fallacies here. So, appeals to popularity, the plural of testimonial is not data. So just because we happen to have a lot of different claims from trustworthy people, that alone doesn't make the claim believable, does it?
In the United States, you can die because an eyewitness saw you murder somebody, they testify in court, and you can die because of it. I can promise you, eyewitness testimony is very important. These students pay a lot of money to study history, which is based on eyewitness testimony. It's a legitimate form of knowledge.
I didn't say that it wasn't. My question is to whether or not it's rational and true. The fact that somebody claims something in and of itself is not sufficient, correct?
Well, you know the answer to that. Obviously, if I claim to be Superman, it doesn't mean I'm Superman.
Sure. How do we tell which parts of the Bible are true and literal, and which parts aren't?
By studying literary style. If something's parable, you know it's a parable. If it's hyperbole, you know it's hyperbole. If it's historical narrative, you read it as historical narrative. If it's apocalyptic literature, like the book of Revelation, you read it as apocalyptic literature. You know very well you'd flunk out of this institution if you went to biology class and treated it as poetry. And you also know you'd flunk out of this place if you went to English class and treated it as chemistry. You've got to learn to distinguish between literary styles: scientific, historical, poetry, symbolic.
How do we tell who's got it right and who's got it wrong?
By studying the text, the context, by studying the historical context, by finding out how many eyewitnesses saw this event. In science, by studying whether the experiment works not in just San Marcos, Texas, but also in London, England, or in Calcutta, India. So you have different ways to test whether something is true or not.
So is Genesis literal? Like a six-day creation literal?
I can promise you, if you study Genesis 1 carefully, you will notice that it is Hebrew poetry. Which means if you go to a poem with a stopwatch, that's intellectually dishonest. You cannot go with a stopwatch to a poem.
That's fine. I mean, you keep promising me things. You can promise me all damn night long. It doesn't have to be more effective than testimonials. So, in your view, you look at Genesis 1 as poetry. There are others who would disagree with you, and you're saying that they're wrong, which I agree with you. I happen to agree with you on this one. But there are other individuals who believe in a God, the same God you do, who believe this revelation, who disagree with you on the issue of Genesis.
So what?
Okay.
What difference does that make?
Well, the difference that it makes is that this is a book where there are two people who believe many of the same things about it, and one thing very, very different, and we have no way to distinguish between the two.
Oh, gosh, that's scary. Sir, just because there are different interpretations of the Bhagavad Gita or the Quran doesn't mean that the Quran and the Bhagavad Gita are not communicating some very clear claims. So you better learn to read for yourself. You better not take it from me. You better not take it from Matt. You as a thinking human being better go to the source document, in this case the New Testament Gospels, or Genesis, and read it for yourself. Studying literary style, reading in context. You've got to do your homework, guys. I've got to do my homework. Matt, you've got to do your homework.
I've done my homework, so why doesn't the Christian God just come down and reveal himself and clarify these issues for us?
Because he's God, which means he's not a little toy or plaything that you can jerk around, or I can jerk around.
How is it jerking around to demand the person who wants you to believe something to actually make a demonstration of its truth reasonably and responsibly?
Because after he has done exactly that, made a demonstration of his reality responsibly, rationally, and thoughtfully, for someone to say, that's not enough, is a game. It's a game. It's a dishonest game, intellectually dishonest game.
So because somebody might, after God does all this, say, oh, I still don't believe, that's enough of a reason for God to not bother doing it for all the people who sincerely and honestly seek out this sort of evidence and would require this sort of evidence in order to be intellectually, rationally justified.
Matt, the overwhelming evidence is that around the world, every culture has some type of belief in God or gods. Your belief system, sir, is a very small group of people who happen to be very white, very Western, and very enlightenment in their thinking.
And bearded.
No, not bearded, but very white, very Western. That is where you find atheism. You do not find atheism in South America, in Asia, in Africa.
That's time.
Yep.
The question is, do all religions lead to the same God? But once again, we're talking about purpose, and there's a couple things that I want to kind of backtrack and address. One is this continued objection to, without God, there's no ultimate meaning, there's no real purpose. Well, I don't know what you mean by real purpose. That seems kind of cheaty. But as far as ultimate meaning, yes, I agree. No ultimate meaning in the existential sense that you're talking about it, and it doesn't matter one bit. The car that I've got out there parked in the parking lot, I've had for a couple of years, one of these days, it's going to rot away. Does that mean it's not valuable now? Does that mean it doesn't have any value to me now? Does it mean there's no purpose? Should I just go ahead and chuck it now? Let's get rid of it. Eventually it's going to be useless. That's absurd. We all recognize that things have meaning and purpose right now because they are valuable to us. These are properties that we imbue things with and we imbue people with. Do I matter as much to you as your spouse? Bet you I don't, unless it's you. This idea that without the ultimate meaning, or if something is ultimately meaningless, doesn't mean it is always meaningless, or it doesn't mean it's meaningless in every way. This idea about morality, that it's all relative. Actually, I'm a staunch defender of absolute morality, and despite Cliffe's straw man, I'm not saying that slavery is immoral because I said so. It might surprise some people to know that while I don't think there's intrinsic value, I think that there is value in people, and that's the value that we imbue them with. This idea that because I said so is the basis for secular morality is flatly absurd. It's the exact opposite of what I just finished talking about how you go through and you build up this system. We are physical beings in a physical universe that follows physical laws. There are truths to be discovered about how our actions benefit us and how our actions harm us. This is simply true. We don't need another mind. This is about the interaction of minds, but we don't need some transcendent mind to dictate what is true. We discover what is true about the reality that we inhabit. God or not, soul or not, we can choose everything on the list that Cliffe just talked about being good to each other and building a productive society and caring and loving and trying to end poverty, trying to end oppression, and trying to build a better society. We can do all of that just because it's the right thing to do. There's no evidence for a soul. In fact, there's good evidence against it. There's no evidence, or not enough evidence, of the various God claims that are out there, or not any particularly good evidence, at least that I've been made aware of. But I could be wrong. And tomorrow, I could find out that there is a God, and that I do have a soul. And it wouldn't change very much for me as far as how I end up living my life, because I've already come to good reasons to do things. Now, I'm open to being corrected on them, but what's going to correct me is reason and evidence, not appealing to a God. And if people have asked me, well, what are you going to do if you die and you end up standing before God? Hey, I tried. I used my brain. I followed the evidence where it was. And by the way, if your character is actually accurately depicted in the Bible or the Quran, I don't want nothing to do with you. I'm already morally superior to you. I already care more about people than you do. I know. I've never sanctioned slavery. Never sanctioned genocide. Gods have. Do all religions lead to the same God? I don't know. I think it's unlikely. I think they clearly all define God differently. I think you could go right down into the same church on the same pew and get two different people, and they're going to define God differently, and they're going to have different views of God. I think there's as many different religions as there are people trying to practice them. And my concern isn't whether or not they all lead to the same God. It's what kind of world do they end up creating? Because why should I care about an afterlife that I don't know whether or not it exists when I've got a life that I know that I have, and I'd like to make it better? And if your religion is impeding on the ability of people who don't practice your religion, or those who do, from living the best life they can right now, then your religion's a problem. That goes for Islam and Christianity and Scientology and Hinduism and everything. If you're advocating something that is detracting from the good of this world, you're part of the problem.
Thank you, gentlemen. Matt, the next question will start with you. Does being an atheist require the same faith that believing in God does?
No. I'm seriously, it doesn't require any faith to not believe something. It doesn't. Now, if atheism was this assertion that there are no gods, I'm pissing people off. If atheism was this assertion that there are no gods, well then yes, you might be able to make a case that that was based on faith, or maybe it's not. It would depend on what the basis, what the foundation for that particular belief was. But atheism in the weak atheism sense of I do not believe this, doesn't require faith. I don't believe there's a Bigfoot. That's not a faith. It's not a faith-based position. I'm not asserting certainty that there isn't a Bigfoot. I'm just not yet convinced. The Bigfoot claim hasn't met its burden of proof. Neither have alien abductions, which, by the way, I'll point out, you can actually go talk to real living people right now who will tell you their alien abduction story. Living, breathing people, you can talk to them. They will have stories that are similar in detail. In some cases, there are multiple people who've supposedly experienced this together. In some cases, the things that people have seen have been entire small towns. And you can interview these people. How many people think that they're actually being abducted by aliens? Not me. And that's people you can talk to right now. Somebody writes a couple books, in a couple thousand years, somebody could stand up and say, hey, look, I wouldn't believe it, but look at all of these accounts. These are first-hand people. They were interviewed by the news. We have a much better record of what was happening at the end of the 20th and beginning of 21st century than we do about what happened back when Jesus was supposedly alive, or back around the time that Hinduism was being formed. This is a real record. We even have video footage of people talking about how they came down. And then they'll start tying it together in an intricate little web, the same way conspiracy theorists do right now. Oh, there were lizard people in the government or crop circles out there. We don't believe any of that, I hope. I am at Texas State. I kind of respect you guys, because I don't care about colleges, so we're not in any rivalry. UT. But we don't believe that. Why should we? And yet we're expected to believe what is potentially a more extraordinary claim and weaker evidence. There's nothing particularly extraordinary about a universe that's billions, 13.7 billion years old, that there might be some other life somewhere. I don't know. Probably unlikely they made it this far. No reason for them to pick out Earth because we're not special, despite what many creationists would have you believe. They've got this wily coyote god who straps on a hat and balances on a wire and goes through all this stuff to catch a coyote. He builds this entire massive universe, all for one mammalian species on this little bitty insignificant dot. Did the aliens get here? I don't know. I don't think so. I don't have any good reason to believe that they did. Doesn't mean I believe that they didn't. And yet we're expected to believe the more extraordinary claims of religion on less sound evidence. We're expected to believe miracles, things that suspend or violate the laws of nature. There's nothing about alien abductions that necessarily violates the laws of nature. Is there? I mean, it's at least slightly more reasonable, and yet we don't believe it with people you can talk to. And yet we're going to point to anonymous books that are hearsay accounts, copies of translations of copies by unknown and anonymous authors, wherein which we know there are forgeries. Anybody seen Snake Salvation on TV? It's on National Geographic. It's about the snake-handling Pentecostals, and they rely on Mark 16, somewhere in the 9 through 20 section, I think it's around verse 18, where she'll take up serpents. Mark 16, 9 through 20 is almost certainly a forgery. It doesn't exist in the oldest and best manuscripts, yet they believe it. Maybe it should be there. Maybe they're the ones that are right. I like snakes. I've got pet snakes. I'm not going to handle them. And I'm certainly, I'm going to handle mine. I'm not going to handle venomous snakes for fun, and certainly not as an exercise of faith, because there's not really good evidence that it's actually something that we should encourage, because those guys get bit and die all the time. And my pastor friends who don't adhere to that particular doctrine look at them and say, hey, dummy, God gave you a brain and doctors. Go. There's not agreement on these issues about gods. We don't have good evidence for these things. What we have are fallacies and tired old arguments that have been rebutted over and over again. If there is a God, he knows exactly what it would take to convince me. He hasn't done it, which means he either doesn't exist or he doesn't want me to know he exists.
Does being an atheist require the same faith that believing in God does?
No, an atheist has a type of faith that says, I'm going to live for someone or something other than God. And the fascinating question that I love to ask my atheist friends is, what do you live for? And what is the evidence that whatever it is you live for is true? Now, the majority of my atheist friends living in the United States live for money. And it makes sense. Money can benefit you a great deal. Nothing wrong with money. But is the ultimate purpose of life to live for money? So my secular materialist friends are very talented. The majority of them work on Wall Street. And the majority of my secular materialist friends live for the American dollar. I think we live in a culture that puts a premium on that. I'm not saying that Matt does. I'm just saying the majority of my atheist friends, who are very wonderful people, live for money. Others of them live for pleasure. They've reduced the purpose of life to stimulating my nerve endings. I understand that. I enjoy pleasure. I'm convinced that pleasure is a gift from God. The central nervous system that I have that gives me pleasure is good. The taste buds on my tongue that enable me to enjoy food is good. But to reduce the purpose of life to stimulating my nerve endings, I mean, come on. Now, what I find interesting is Matt consistently says, well, there's not enough evidence. Fine. What I would love to hear from Matt is, what am I living for? And what's the evidence that what I am living for is true? See, friends, all of us are going to put our heads on our pillows tonight. None of us can prove that what we're living for is true. The question, though, is, what's the evidence that whatever it is you're living for is reliable and true? And there are a lot of different options out there. Now, Matt likes to talk a lot about the Bible, so let's talk about the Bible. The Gospels that we have in English today are based on over 5,200 Greek manuscripts or pieces of manuscript dated from the 2nd through the 10th century AD, all agreeing to an infinitesimal degree. There is no document from antiquity that can even approach the New Testament Gospels in manuscript evidence. Secondly, you have 4 different Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're not carbon copies. Obviously, they use notes. There are similarities in language between especially the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But there's a tremendous internal consistency between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There are no major contradictions. There are different perspectives. The same way that if you and I were standing on a street corner and we saw 2 cars coming down the street and we heard a woman scream, there was a screech of brakes, and then there was a collision. If you and I went to the police department and you said, "Officer, I saw the 2 cars coming down the street. I heard a woman scream and then there was a collision." And if I were to say, "Officer, I saw the 2 cars coming down the street. I heard a screech of brakes and then there was a collision," we're not contradicting each other. We're offering 2 equally valid perspectives on what really happened. And that's what you've got in the Gospels. I'm real glad they're not Xerox copies. They're not photocopies. They're unique perspectives on Jesus of Nazareth. Now, what I find astonishing is that Matt says he went to seminary.
No, I didn't.
All right, you were going into the ministry?
I was going to. I didn't go.
Yeah, you were going to go into the ministry. Okay? Which means you probably read the Bible. And then when you reel off a statement that the Bible doesn't say anything against slavery, that's embarrassing. Let me tell you why it's embarrassing. The main point of the book of Philemon in the New Testament is Paul is writing to a slave owner, Philemon. And he is saying, "I met your runaway slave, Onesimus." Now, in the Roman Empire, the law is that you are permitted to execute the guy. He's a runaway slave. But I, Paul, am asking you, Philemon, to take Onesimus back, no longer as a slave, but as a brother in Christ. Who do you think fought and finally won for the abolition of slavery in the British Empire? A man named William Wilberforce, who served in the British Parliament, and it was due to his faith in Christ that he struggled against slavery in the entire British Empire until he won just before he died. Why did William Wilberforce fight for the abolition of slavery in the British Empire? Because he was a devoted follower of Christ, and he understood that all human beings are created in the image of God. Therefore, to stand against slavery and to stand for the value and dignity of all of human life is not an option. So I can promise you, folks, you got to read the text for yourself. Because if a man as intelligent as he can say, the Bible never says anything against slavery, you got to read it for yourself. Read Philemon in the New Testament.
Thank you, gentlemen. Cliff, the next question will start with you. Why would a loving God allow so much suffering?
I do not know why God allowed evil and suffering. For thousands of years, philosophers and theologians have struggled with that question. They've never come up with an ultimate answer. And I am not going to be able to ultimately answer you. I do not know. But as a follower of Christ, I have to think. First point. Genesis chapter 1 records that when God created this, God saw that it was good. When God created that, God saw that it was good. So God did not create evil, suffering, and death. But in Genesis chapter 3, we read how human beings rebel against God. And when we told God to step off, to get lost, to remove his act elsewhere, he partially honored our request. And when God stepped back, chaos, destruction, and death entered the world. So you and I were not born into a fair world. You and I are born into an unfair world. Not because God created it that way, but because the all-powerful God chose to partially limit his power by creating me free. If I haul back and slap this man and turn to you and say, God made me do it, I'm a con artist. I'm a liar. God gave me a hand for the purpose of loving and respecting this man. But because I have a free will, I can roll this hand into a fist and send it crashing into his handsome face. If I have the audacity to say God made me do it, I'm a liar. I have a free will. And you and I live in a world where there's a tremendous amount of suffering, evil, and death that's a direct result of human irresponsibility. But remember, when we human beings rebel against God, God steps back and evil, chaos, suffering, and death enter the experience of humankind. Now, why? Why did God choose to create us with free will? Ultimately, I do not know. Well, come on, Cliff. It would be better if we didn't have free will. Then we wouldn't have evil and all this suffering and death. Yeah? We also wouldn't have love. Because in order to be real, love has to be free. If it ain't free, it ain't love. If he's been dating somebody for the past 2 months, and she has said to him, I love you, and tonight his dad calls him up and says, son, I've been paying her $1,000 a month to date you. He'd be royally bummed out. Why? Because you cannot manipulate or force love. And God created us to live in a love relationship with himself. You cannot force love. Oh, but God's all-powerful. He can do anything he wants. No, that's not what the Bible teaches. God cannot make square circles. God cannot make 2 + 2 = 5. And God cannot make himself exist and not exist at the same time in the same way. Impossible. When the Bible says that God is all-powerful, it means he's all-powerful over his creation. But obviously what he's chosen to do is he's chosen to limit his power and give us free will. And that's why you love. And that's why you enjoy so much when other people love you. Because you know they don't have to love you. You know that they freely choose to love you. Now, Jesus Christ commands us to feed the hungry, to alleviate suffering. And I have younger brothers and sisters, some of whom are medical doctors, some of whom are lawyers, some of whom are teachers. And because of their faith in Christ, they put it on the line. And they serve in Nepal, in India. My brother who's a medical doctor, motivated by his faith in Christ, they serve and they love people to make a practical difference. And so as a follower of Christ, I have no option but to give to those who are hurting. I have no option but to care for the needy. Because the God who created me gave me talents like a rational mind, and he holds me responsible to use those talents in order to serve others. And I don't serve others because of fear of a big stick. Instead, I serve others because I understand the truth that every single human being on the face of the planet has dignity and value, because they're not accidents, they're human beings created in the image of God. And ultimately, because God is a suffering God, he has provided the solution for suffering and death. Forgiveness and eternal life in heaven, where there will be no more HIV positive, no more heart failure, no more cancer, but eternal life in the presence of God. Now, my atheist friend, let's go to the hospital. Come on, my atheist friend. Let's go to the room where the baby lies, whose body is being shredded by terminal cancer. Come, my atheist friend. What is your solution? Tough luck, kid. Your mama didn't read her horoscope. It's fate, destiny, chance. That is the despair of atheism. I, as a follower of Christ, will walk the other side of the bed, and along with my atheist friend, I will hold the child's other hand. But in Jesus Christ, I have a suffering God who died on a cross, rose from the dead to give the ultimate solution for suffering, eternal life in heaven.
It's all right, I'll lose a couple of seconds. There's a lot to get to. I'll start off with the end and then go back to the beginning. As your potential atheist friend who is sitting there looking at a child that's suffering and dying, my answer would be more education, more science, and more medicine, and not one single second spent in prayer. That would be my answer. But when the question that you most wanted me to ask is, what are you living for, and what is the evidence that what you're living for is true? Well, I live for a lot of things, and I could give you a list, but there's not enough time, because the second part of your question, what is the evidence that what you're living for is true, doesn't make any sense. I tried to explain this repeatedly last year. it is presuming, what you're really asking is, what is the evidence that you have the correct purpose? And that assumes the very thing that you're claiming is that there is a correct purpose, that there is some externally imposed, approved by God purpose, which I reject and have rejected over and over again. So I can't give you evidence that what my purpose is true, because that's a question that doesn't make any sense. It's like, what's your favorite ice cream color or flavor? And how do you know that's true? I know it's true that it is. I don't know that it's true that that's the ice cream flavor I'm supposed to like the best. The problem of suffering, or extenuating or egregious suffering, is never one that really bothered me too much when I was a believer. I mean, I had the same questions that everybody else does. And I don't actually find it an argument that I actually engage with very often as an atheist. But going back to the Bible for a second, there's this appeal to internal consistency in the Gospels, which I don't really find particularly convincing, because there's a long tradition of people diligently copying those things down. And of course, they're going to keep the things that are pretty consistent. However, there still are inconsistencies. You can go and try and reconcile the resurrection accounts, and they don't quite match up in any way. People have been trying to do this forever. It's not easy. It doesn't prove they're false. But even if they were completely consistent, that still doesn't tell us whether or not they're true. I can go through the first 100 episodes of the Amazing Spider-Man, and they are internally consistent without any sort of contradictions. And we can go and we can see Manhattan, but that doesn't mean that there was a Spider-Man. Internal consistency is irrelevant. There needs to be evidence for the claims in there, not just a whole bunch of claims that are consistent. As to slavery, sorry, Cliff's wrong. Philemon is not declaring slavery to be immoral or wrong in any way. It's a letter to an individual about a specific slave and how he wants that slave treated. Exodus 21 advocates slavery, includes how you can screw over your fellow Jew, who you were supposed to let go after 6 years, to serve you forever by giving them a wife and kid and having them come say, hey, I got a wife and kid now. I don't want to leave them. I will be yours forever. Leviticus extends these. Deuteronomy declares that slaves are your property that you can pass on to your descendants. Did Jesus clear this up in Bible 2.0? Did Jesus come up and say, that stuff that you heard that we said back, me and God, that was wrong, and here's the correction? No. Slaves, servants, obey your masters, especially the cruel ones. You know what the only humane thing to say to a slave is? Get out and take everybody with you. And if they're cruel, hit them on the way out. That's it. Make your way free. Philemon is not a book tearing down slavery. And Wilberforce, while he was a follower of Christ, and there were plenty of followers of Christ who contributed in the abolition of slavery across the world, they were pointing to some of the same verses that the slave owners were pointing to. And which one was on firmer biblical footing? I have a lot of Christian pastors who are friends, and they're in liberal and moderate Christian churches. They support LGBT rights and all sorts of things, and I love them. They're great. They don't have the biblical foundation that Westboro Baptist Church does, with their hatred, which I despised even when I was a Christian, and so did my parents. And I don't think that they have a good foundation for how they go about it. But their positions are more biblically sound than the gay church in San Francisco that wants to love Jesus with all their heart. The Bible doesn't say what you think it says. And like Cliff, I'll encourage you to read it. I've read it many times and taught it.
And our final prepared question will start with you, Matt. What do you believe in regards to the beginning of the universe?
Well, that's an easy one. I'm going to cheat a little bit and give you 30 seconds on love. I'm not convinced that we choose who to love. I don't know for sure. Not making a declaration, but love seems to be something that happens to me. And then I make choices about what I'm going to do with that. And Cliff said you can't force love, which should also mean that you can't choose love. You choose what you do with the love that kind of happens to you. I think it kind of happens. But what do I believe about the origins of the universe? I don't know. I tell you what I understand. I'm not a physicist. I'm not a cosmologist. I have friends who are. And they have tried Lawrence Krauss sat with me for probably an hour in a taxi trying to clear up some misunderstandings that I had. I have a physicist friend in Austin who used to have the office next to Weinberg there, who wrote a textbook that they use there on quantum mechanics. He's very interested in cosmology. He's actually currently reviewing a model that is set to compete with the Big Bang cosmology. Now, what do I believe? I believe that the Big Bang model is the best current explanation that fits the evidence. That's exactly what science does. It attempts to explain what we see. I believe that I can have confidence, not faith, because I have evidence that the scientific community have demonstrated an expertise here, and that the process of hypothesis, testing, modeling, making predictions, submitting it for peer review, and falsification leads most consistently to the best possible results. If you want to know how something in reality works, that's the most reliable method. Nothing has ever disproved science but more science. There's no religious book that has disproved science. There's no religious insight that has ever come from religion that was of any use at all until it had been confirmed by science. Now, am I advocating scientism? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know what the origin of the universe is. I'm not sufficiently conversant in the subjects. But I know what the best current model is, and I know that if it changes, it'll be based on evidence and reason. I don't have a good answer. Or do I? See, sometimes I don't know is the best answer. I don't know is the answer that lets you go out and find the actual explanation. Rather than pretending that I have come by the one and only possible explanation, which was coincidentally recorded in the holy book that I happen to believe in, and seems to fit my own preconceptions, I can't think of a better explanation than God done it. Fallacy. Well, you can't prove that God didn't do it, so God did it. Fallacy. Look at the Kalam cosmological argument, which he raised earlier. Everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. You know why that first premise has that everything that begins to exist? Because the old one just said everything has a cause, and that screwed them over when it came to God. So they modified it and amended it. That's what they do with all these arguments for the existence of God. Now it's everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. Is that true? It's an inference. Don't know that we've come across anything that began to exist and didn't have a cause, but we might have. All kinds of weirdness in quantum mechanics. There's experiments that have been done with electrons where the direction that they come out after being put through this thing, which I'm not even going to attempt to explain because I'm an idiot when it comes to physics. We know it's 50-50. Absolutely no way to predict which way any individual electron's spin is going to be. It seems to be in effect without a cause. And I have some physicist friends who are actually lobbying that there are many such causeless effects. So I don't know that the first premise is true. After you get past everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence, there is the universe began to exist. Did it? What do you mean by that? Certainly the local representation of the universe that we witness can be traced back to just before the Big Bang event, which has at least been confirmed by observation of cosmic microwave background radiation. But we can't go past the Planck time. And as far as we know, time started with the Big Bang, so before the Big Bang is absurd, which means there couldn't have been a cause before because causality is necessarily temporal. So if there's no time, then there's no time to do anything. So maybe there was an uncaused event. I don't know. All I do know is I don't see any good reason to think there was a God that magicked the universe into existence. I don't understand why it would need to do that. I don't understand the exorbitant fashion in which it did all this. It doesn't make sense. But moreover, there isn't any evidence for it.
The Bible never answers the question, how old is the planet, how old is the universe? So from the Bible, I do not know how old the universe is. That's why I turn to science. And science at this point shows that the universe is about 15 billion years old, 13.7 billion years old. And that's why I accept the universe as being about 13.7 billion years old. The Bible says, in the beginning, God, not in the beginning, hydrogen. Why is that important? That's important because in all of my observation, you never get order and design by chance as a result of an accident. So, if science points to evolution as being the most reasonable, the best supported theory of how we came about, I have no problem with that. What I do have a problem with is the philosophy of evolution as an origin, which states behind this amazing order and design, there's no intelligent mind, there's just chance and fate. I'm sorry. Every example of order and design, separate from nature, because we're obviously debating the issue of nature, but every example of order and design that I see demands a designer. A shirt demands a tailor. If I prepare a delicious meal, set it before you and say, there's no cook, this just happened. That's absurd. If you and I are walking through the Black Hills of South Dakota, we come around a corner and all of a sudden, wow, we look up and there are the heads of 4 presidents on that Mount Rushmore. And if I say to you, wow, isn't it amazing the way the glass just sort of trickled over the rock? Wow, there's George Washington. There's Thomas Jefferson. And here's old Rough Rider Teddy Roosevelt. Isn't it amazing the way that the water just carved out those heads on Mount Rushmore? That's unreasonable. Why? Because the order and the design of those 4 presidents' heads on Mount Rushmore demands a sculpture, demands someone who has forethought, intention, and understands how to bring order out of chaos. So if that's true of everything that I observe in life, then when it comes to the issue that we're debating, which is the universe, nature, the human eye, the central nervous system, it is far more reasonable, it is far more plausible for me to believe that behind the order and the design of the universe is an intelligent mind than it is for me to believe that it's all just chance and fate. And that is one of the main reasons, to tell you the truth, that I overcome my doubts when I doubt God's existence. Because order and design, repeatedly, 100 times out of 100, points to an intelligent mind. Now, I love speaking at Texas State. I also love speaking at the University of Texas, up in Austin. And there's a wonderful philosophy professor there named Rob Kunz. He's a philosophy professor at UT Austin. And so I invite Rob to come out and communicate his faith to the students. And Dr. Rob Kunz, the philosophy department at UT, stands up and says, one of the reasons that I'm most grateful for my faith in Jesus Christ is I do not have to struggle through epistemological nihilism the way my fellow philosophy professors do here. Epistemological nihilism is basically an understanding that if there is no God, you can't know anything ultimately with certainty. Why? Because what is your mind? Your mind is an accidental collection of atoms. What is your mind? Well, as Charles Darwin wrote to a man named Mr. Graham in a letter, your mind is simply a highly developed monkey's mind. Would you trust the thoughts of a monkey? Darwin asked. See, that's what I say is intellectually consistent. If I believe that my mind has no intelligent mind behind it, but is simply the result of chance and fate, then why do I trust my mind to tell me that it's just the result of chance and fate? I was speaking at Columbia University in New York City, and a bunch of freshmen came out of humanities class, and they said, Cliff, how do you know that your mind was not put together by a bunch of very intelligent scientists in a vat this morning? I thought that they were playing games with me. They weren't. Their Columbia University professor was encouraging them to think through the logical implications of there not being a God. If there is no God, your mind is simply a chemical accident. Why do you trust the chemical accident? The reason I trust my mind is because I'm convinced it's not an accident. It's a gift from a rational creator.
Thank you, gentlemen. Now we'll begin taking some questions that have been texted in from our students. And since we're running a little bit behind time, let me request we limit our comments to 4 minutes, if we can do that. That might throw off our timer over there, but we'll make do. First question comes from a student out of Houston. And we'll go ahead and start with you, Cliff. Why does it seem as if people project their personal preferences onto God or the lack of? And do you both feel that you're doing this? How do you reconcile that?
One of the reasons, and some people don't appreciate it, that I stick so much to evidence in answering the question, why do I believe God exists? Why do I believe that Jesus is the truth? Is because my challenge as a thinking human being, and I think your challenge as a thinking human being, is to be objective. Follow the evidence wherever it leads. And if the way you live your life points to the fact that you hunger for meaning in life, you know the value of love, you long for life after death, you know that there are some objective morals, like the abuse of an innocent child is never good. In other words, morality is not all relative. Partially relative, yes, but all relative? No. There are objective morals which demands an intelligent mind behind the universe. If that's what you experience life as, then follow the evidence. And the evidence points straight to the existence of God. Now, I grew up in New England. I didn't grow up in Texas. And in New England, it's not popular to believe in God. And I went to a New England prep school. And in that New England prep school, there was one other believer in Christ. So I had to think through my faith hard. And there were a lot of questions that I couldn't answer, and there still are a lot of questions I can't answer. But I can promise you, if you study the evidence of your life, if you observe reality around you, the evidence is God exists. And if you look hard at Jesus Christ, the evidence is he spoke the truth. In fact, if you listen to Matt carefully, Matt agrees with Jesus when it comes to ethics, doesn't he? In fact, almost all of my atheist friends agree with Jesus in the majority of ethical issues. In fact, when you study anthropology around the world, every culture, it's like we're all reading off the same sheet music, because there's an amazing agreement regarding adultery, regarding stealing, regarding murder. We human beings have been hardwired by God with a conscience, and we understand good. But what is so ironic and so paradoxical is that Matt keeps on referring to, I just decide, because I've got an intellect, what's right and what's wrong. Well, guess what? The most brilliant nation of the world in the 20th century committed Dachau, Auschwitz, and Buchenwald. It is not enough to have a brilliant mind. The question is, what are you going to do with that mind? Are you going to gas Jews because you think they're a lower level of the evolutionary cycle? Or are you going to stand for justice, for compassion, for the value and dignity of all of human life? And if so, why? You see, friends, the evidence is that God exists. The evidence is Jesus Christ is reliable. And that is why Africans, Asians, people in South America, far more than the West, have put their faith in Jesus Christ. Because the overwhelming evidence is he loves you. He sacrificed his life for you. He wants you to live with him now. He's not violating your conscience. He agrees with your conscience. He calls you to live a life of selflessness. He calls you to live a life rooted in his love, in his grace, in his truth, and then to give your life away in serving others. And that's why you get an education, so that you can serve people more effectively. And an education is good because it's using the rational mind that God gave you to do that which is best.
Can we get another water when we get time?
You want water?
You might end up needing yours.
No, I don't need it. Go ahead, man. It's okay.
So you can't do that. That's cheating.
How is it cheating? How's it cheating, man?
Got a 20?
How?
Got a 20? No,
Yeah, you want a 20?
no, I don't. But
You want a 20? It's right here, bud. You asked for it.
No, see, it's cheating.
There's the
because-
20.
No. I'll donate this to the church then, that put this together.
Good. Not Westboro Baptist, okay?
Sure, I'm thrilled to hear that atheists are now a majority in New England, because evidently it's not popular to believe in God in New England, although I thought they were still over at least 50% theists in New England. And yeah, it's interesting. The question was about, do people kind of superimpose their own ideas onto God? And yes, in fact, we've done testing, and we know this is the case, because there are different portions of the brain that are about, I think this, and someone else thinks this. And curiously, when asked what God thinks, the part that lights up for I think this is the part that lights up, not the part for someone else thinks this. But unfortunately, as much as I'd like to just be nice to Cliff, if you imply that Hitler was an atheist who gassed Jews because they're lower on the evolutionary ladder, you have just committed a despicable act, because Hitler professed to be, in public and private, atheist, a Christian, supported by the Catholic Church. The Nazis ran around with Gott mit uns on their belt buckles, which is God with us, and evolution was banned in Germany. The teaching of evolution was banned. You don't get to lay this at the feet of science, and you don't get to claim that a monster, just because he doesn't happen to believe in God the same way you did, was anything at all like an atheist or a secular humanist or anything along those lines. It's just flatly false. Cliff and I completely agree. Follow the evidence wherever it leads. And yet, curiously, no sooner had he said follow the evidence where it leads, what did he say? And if you find yourself hungering for an afterlife, that's not following the evidence. That's following your desires. If you find evidence for an afterlife, by all means. But if you find yourself hungering for an afterlife, maybe what you're hungering for isn't real. Where's the evidence for it? I followed the evidence where it led. Turned out, my desire to fulfill 1 Peter 3:15 and be the best representative of Christ I could be clearly led me to here. It's all part of God's plan, right? We know that people project their own thoughts onto what they think God thinks. What Cliff would probably have us believe, this is unfair, I don't want to put words in his mouth. What many theists would have us believe is that they're not doing that. Other people are, they're not. Not the true Christians. They don't do that. How do you know? How do you prove this? Well, by their fruits you'll know them. Okay. Look, Matt even agrees with Jesus. I agree with Jesus when he was right. You want to find out the truth, go to ironchariots.org. I've got an entire verse-by-verse deconstruction of the Sermon on the Mount because I got tired of even some atheists saying, oh, this is the greatest and most wise thing anybody's ever said. No, it's not. There's some good advice in there. There's some bad advice in there, and there's some horrible advice in there. There's stuff in there that turns people into victims, and it is polluting conversations. Because there are some people who, I imagine people would point to and say, oh, they're not true Christians, but they are completely, excuse my language, assholes about their faith, and when somebody calls them out on it, you'll be persecuted in his name, so clearly I must be doing it right because you're persecuting me. No, maybe you're just an ass. Maybe. And maybe you're not. How do we know? Follow the evidence. What's the evidence? Tell us about this. I have yet to find any evidence that's convincing. And these are not trivial claims. That somebody was a god, lived, died, rose from the dead, saved the world, drove people out of a temple. I mean, that might be a trivial thing. We need evidence. Follow it. Read, study. I didn't get here by accident, no matter how Cliff wants to straw man my comments.
Next question's coming to us from Austin, Texas. So, Matt, we'll start with you. What do you both think or believe will happen after you die?
I imagine my wife will get married to somebody else, and actually, she's going to run off with a friend of hers and have a whole bunch of cats. Oh, you mean what's going to happen to me? I don't know. I don't see any reason to think that anything's going to happen to me. Everything that makes me me, everything that we have historically and religiously attributed to a soul that can be identified with a place, has a place in the brain. My personality is in my brain. We know from experiments on people who have suffered all sorts of brain damage that you can reset people's personality, their preference, their memories, their ability to make new memories. I'm going to get the name wrong. Vishwanathan, no. Somebody will know. Anyway, did a talk at one of the religion summits about a split brain patient, hemispherectomy. They can communicate with both halves, and each half has its separate personality and a separate identity and communicates independently. One half, Christian. The other half, atheist. Now, I guess you could argue that when we split that brain in half, there was only enough soul for one side, and the other side just got, shafted. But everything we know about what makes us us, our likes, our preferences, our desires, they're all a product of the brain. Now, a lot of theists would say that there's a soul behind it all, as a puppet master, the ghost in the machine. And yet there's no evidence to support this. And it doesn't make sense in the model. If I suffer severe brain damage and all of a sudden I don't remember the past, I don't remember that I love my wife, I don't like the same foods, I don't want to interact with the same people, and now all of a sudden I believe in God, am I the same person? I don't think so. Haven't we really kind of ended up with a whole new person? I have an argument that I use partially as a joke. It's an argument that demonstrates, according to some traditions, nobody's in heaven, and it's really easy. In heaven, there's no suffering and no sadness, according to some traditions. My mom is convinced she's going to heaven, and she's convinced I'm going to hell. I don't know who's going to end up in heaven, but it won't be my mom. There's no way my mom could be up in heaven, not suffering and not sad that her son is in hell. And if God does some kind of magic to take that out of her, it's not my mom anymore. It's a facsimile of my mom. Some kind of robotic worshiping thing that's not my mom. My mom and I disagree vehemently on religious stuff, so much so we don't talk about it anymore because we love each other and we'd like to have a civil, Thanksgiving or Christmas or whatever religious holiday drives me up there to visit and hang out. By the way, we celebrate Christmas. Have a big white tree with peppermints and stuff on it. It's awesome. Entirely secular stuff. We're stealing it back because Christianity stole most of those things from other religions. And Easter too, but I'm not that big on eggs and candy because I'm diabetic. But everything that we know about us takes place in our brain. Your brain gets damaged. Are you the same person? I don't know. The math on souls is confusing. Sam Harris has talked about the math on souls for people who believe that zygotes get a soul because the embryo will sometimes split and then re-get together. So when it splits, does it have two souls? And then when it comes back together, does it just have one? Or now do we have a body with two souls? Or did we not put a soul in until afterwards? Or does it happen when he breathes his first breath, as the Jews believed? It doesn't make any sense. The math on souls doesn't make sense. The science on souls doesn't make any sense. There's no reason to think that there's some kind of ghost dictating what goes on in my brain. We haven't even gotten into free will. Cliffe keeps asserting that we have it. I'm not convinced we do, at least not in the sense that he's talking about. I don't know what's going to happen to me when I'm dead. I'm pretty sure my body's going to rot, my brain's going to stop working, and I will cease to exist. And it didn't bother me before I was alive, so I don't see why it'd bother me afterwards.
Guys, we got to be honest with each other. If there is no God, we know exactly what happens when we die. If there is no God, there's no life after death. If there is no God, you are matter and energy. And when you die, the matter and energy fall apart. So let's not act like maybe there's life after death. No, that's illogical. If there is no God, when you die, when I die, we become fertilizer. Very logical, very reasonable. But you know what the problem is? The problem is that I've got to do funerals for families that are atheist or agnostic. Inevitably, what happens to me is I'm standing there and they're coming up to me saying, well, maybe, the Great Spirit. Excuse me? Great Spirit? What are you talking about? If there is no God, there's no Spirit. There's matter and energy. And when we die, the matter and energy falls apart. Now don't get scared. Just face reality. Be objective. And don't allow your fears to get you knocking your knees saying, oh, well, maybe. Oh, well, possibly. No. Be rational. Use your good mind. If there is no God, when you die, you rot. When I die, I rot. End of story. Just think about it. Now, there's an alternative to that. And the alternative is that if there's a supernatural God, then possibly there is life after death. And I can promise you, I would never believe there's life after death because I'm scared to die. That's being a wimp. That's being a coward. Instead, you'd better use your brain, and you better start thinking, and you better figure out, does the evidence point to there being something more to reality than matter and energy, there being some type of God, or does there not? And then secondly, you better use your brain, and you better think real clearly. Does the historical evidence point to Jesus having died and risen from the dead or not? And I can promise you, if you believe there's life after death because you're scared to die, you're an intellectual wimp. And I would never believe there's life after death because I find it attractive. And Matt is wrong. I don't believe there's life after death because I've got this deep longing for life after death. But I'll tell you exactly what I do. If I find that I have a deep longing for something, I look at the evidence to find out, is there any truth to it or not? And if there's no truth to it, I drop it. But if there is evidence to support it, I would be very wise to follow that evidence. Now, why do I believe there's life after death? First of all, because the evidence says there is a supernatural God. And second of all, because the historical evidence is that Jesus was dead, and 3 days later, he rose from the dead. And the people who saw him risen from the dead died not for belief. They died for what they claimed to have seen, the dead Christ risen from the dead. If you claim to have seen something, like Matthew, Mark, John, Thomas, Philip, Andrew, Peter, if you claim to have seen the dead Christ risen from the dead, and then you stand before Roman soldiers, and the Roman soldiers say Caesar is Lord and live, or else maintain that Jesus is risen from the dead, and we will execute you for it. And if you stand there and say, I'm sorry, I've seen Jesus risen from the dead, that gives your claim tremendous credibility. So the evidence is Jesus rose from the dead. That's why I'm convinced when he promises you eternal life, if you trust in him, he ain't blowing smoke, he's speaking the truth.
We've had a good number of questions being texted in. Obviously, we can't cover a ton of those tonight, so in order to allow time for your closing comments, we'll make this our last question from students. This comes from Waco, Texas. How do you both explain love? Is it a real thing?
Who goes first?
We'll go back with you, Cliff.
Me? All right. If there is no God, you have reduced reality to matter and energy. Which means the student at Duke University was absolutely right when he said to me, Cliff, there is no God. And I asked, fine, then what motivates Mother Teresa to do what she's doing among the dying in Calcutta, India? And he was spot on when he said, the drive to preserve the genetic pool. That's what motivates Mother Teresa. And I said, I'm sorry, I don't agree. I don't think that Mother Teresa has to work among the dying in Calcutta, India. I think that she freely chooses to. I think that she freely chooses to love people who are dying ghastly deaths. And that ability to choose to love is part of what it means to be a human being. And every atheist, every agnostic, every human being has the ability to love. All of my atheist friends love. Very deeply they love. But what is love? Love is not simply a biochemical reaction, a sex drive, or a drive to preserve the genetic pool. Love is a decision of the will to care for someone else. Now, I think Matt's definition of love, it's something that just comes to you, is straight out of Hollywood. In other words, love in America for too many of us is something you fall into and fall out of. It's a feeling that just sort of overwhelms you. Jesus said, love your enemy. I never have good feelings for my enemy. So is Jesus being unrealistic when he commands us to love our enemies? No. Because when you read the New Testament and the Old Testament, what you begin to realize is love is not a feeling that you either fall into or out of. Rather, love is a decision of the will to pray for and to work for the well-being and the success of another human being, even if that person is your enemy. So, you and I are created to love. We all have a free will, and we all choose whether to love or to seek revenge. We all choose whether to love or to be apathetic. We all choose whether we love or hate. And I can promise you, if you put your faith in Christ, all that he wants to do is help you to love others better. And that has been my experience. I went to Davidson College down in North Carolina to play basketball. The only problem was I wasn't good enough to play D1 basketball. So I barely made the team, and I had good seats for every game. And there was an assistant coach who would stand on the sidelines during basketball practice, and he would mock me. And my teammates would come up to me and say, hey man, what have you done against this guy that he treats you like a piece of dirt? And I'd say, I don't know. But inside me, I felt a hatred and a resentment towards this man, because he stood between me and what I wanted to do most in life at that time, play against NC State and Notre Dame and St. John's and Chapel Hill and UCLA. And I resented the guy's presence on planet Earth, to put it honestly. But I reached the point in my life where I said, God, I've tried to love the man and I can't stand him. Would you please help me? And I experienced a power outside of myself to love a basketball coach who I on my own hated. That's what Jesus wants to do in our lives. He wants to give us the power from within to change and to love even our enemy, even the person who cuts us off at the knees. He wants to give us the power to forgive. And to forgive is difficult, because when someone hurts me badly enough, what's going off in my head is Rocky, 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 blast him into the next generation. And Jesus says, no, forgive. Absorb the hit, forgive. And I find that to be really living.
So on a couple occasions we heard if there is no God, then there's only matter and energy, which I'll just point out is not actually true. Whether or not there's a God is one question, and whether or not there's something else is another. And Cliffe wants to say if there's no God, then there's just matter and energy. I think Buddhists would disagree with him. They don't believe in a God, and yet they believe in all sorts of, some of them, supernatural things like karma and reincarnation and things like that. But Cliffe's model, his head is the only one he can see. When it comes to love, he brought up the example of Mother Teresa. If you're Catholic, I'm probably going to piss you off, but if you haven't read Christopher Hitchens' missionary position, you probably should. Because Mother Teresa was not an agent of love. She was in love with suffering. And she felt that suffering brought people closer to God. So she brought in millions in donations and left people laying on squalid floors, suffering and dying because it was God's will. She was not some agent of change. She did not provide the medical treatments in many cases that would have been necessary, that would have been a real demonstration of loving someone and caring about them. She loved her idea of God, which included suffering, as a primary demonstration of what God wanted out of these people's lives. Now, I'm not advocating really a Hollywood love. I was just, when I said, love's kind of something that happens, I was talking about how you fall in love or meet somebody. I don't remember making any sort of conscious choice. Maybe I did. The demonstration of will was what I do with love. What is love? How do I explain love? Well, yeah, it's something that happens in the brain. Electrical, chemical signals, blah, 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 blah. We can distill that down until it seems to some to be just really kind of sterile and clinical. How is it any less wonderful? If you discover that the experience that you've had of being in love does not actually come from an external source, you still had that feeling. It's the same. It's true. The experience isn't diminished, and I would argue that this constant appeal to gods as external sources for things like love diminish them. People look at flowers. Flowers are beautiful. I love flowers. Not as much as some people, but I love flowers. Is a flower more beautiful because God made it? Of course not. The fact that there is some all-powerful God means that he could have created a flower that when you looked at it, sent you over the edge into euphoric bliss and immediately into orgasm that surpassed everything everywhere. But the flower's still beautiful, even though it doesn't do that. And love, whether you think it comes from God or whether you think that it's just what happens in your brain, still the same. There's no demonstration that there's a God required for this. Just like when I eat certain things and enjoy them, or when I hear certain music. One of the things that helped me figure out all those times in the past where I was convinced, like everybody around me, that I had experienced the Holy Spirit right then and there, was coming to the understanding that I could have that same or similar euphoric experience from secular music, from beauty, from art, from Mount Rushmore. Which, by the way, the reason we recognize Mount Rushmore is designed is because we have mountains of evidence for it, and no mechanism by which mountains spontaneously generate faces, which is not the same as life. We recognize design not by complexity, but by contrasting it with that which is naturally occurring. And life is naturally occurring. There's a mechanism for replication there. And walking along and finding the one thing that looks different is absurd if you believe in a God, because with Paley's watchmaker thing, if you walk along and find a watch and it was clearly designed, wrong. Because in the God-believing universe, you're walking around on a universe full of watches through a pasture of watches and picking up one watch and saying, this one's special.